loose from infirmities and disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing can hold me now. I'm standing on solid ground. The word of the Lord. I've got the victory over my enemies. Who the sun sets free is free indeed. My chains are broken. Thank God I am loose. Oh yes I am. Yes I am. I am loose. Oh yes I am. Yes I am. I am loose.
Good afternoon. I'm Elder Holland of Salem Bible Church, Atlanta campus. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's noonday Bible study lesson. Last week, we learned about greed from the perspective of living the good life. This week, we're going to focus on greed as a deadly sin. That's right. Greed is a sin. And you know, the wages of sin is death. If you have your Bible, our key verses will come from Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, and Psalm chapter 49, verse 20. But before we begin going over these verses, let's ask ourselves, what do we know about greed? The Bible said greed is idolatry. And we know idolatry is a sin. Greed appears in the Bible in over 70 passages, which tells us how concerned God is about greed. The Bible itself characterized greed into 4 categories. The first category is hoarding, which is having and wanting more with a feeling of not having enough. The second category is overspending. That is, spending more than what you have in order to attain those things you do not need. The third category is comparison, what I call the Jones effect, constantly trying to keep up with what others have. And then finally, entitlement. Like the rich young man in Matthew chapter 19 who had everything, but considered salvation just another form of entitlement. I pray that you don't find yourself in any of these categories. But if you do, it's not too late to make a change, to turn from sin and back toward God. Matthew tells us in chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, concerning treasures, Jesus said this, "Do not store up yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up your treasures yourself in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Jesus goes on to say in verses 22 and 23, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness?" Finally, in verse 24, Jesus tells us, "No one can serve 2 masters, for a slave would either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Well, at that time, Jesus was referring to the Pharisees who were trying to serve both God and wealth. What are these verses in Matthew telling us? First, Matthew was referring to the Pharisees in these passages, but if we're not careful, this could easily apply to me and you. You see, one's attitude toward wealth is another barometer of righteousness. The Pharisees believed the Lord materially blessed all he loved. They were intent on building great treasures on earth. But treasures built here are subject to decay. Moth destroys cloth, rust destroys metal, whereas treasures deposited in heaven can never be lost. You see, the Pharisees had this problem because their spiritual eyes were diseased. With their eyes, they was coveting money and wealth. Thus, they were in spiritual darkness. They were slaves to the master of greed. And their desire for money was so great, they were failing in their service to their true master, God. Are you in need of an eye checkup? Has greed caused you to fail in your service to God? In the final analysis, we serve our Father in heaven, and any distraction from that service is a sin. Turning to Psalms chapter 49, verses 20, it reads, "Mortals cannot abide in their pomp. They are like animals that perish." The writer of this psalm is telling us that it is foolish to be jealous of unbelieving wealthy people, for their doom is sure. Though they enjoy great splendor and prosper in this life, they pass away into darkness, taking nothing with them. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 15 puts it this way: "As they came from their mother's womb, so they shall go again. Naked as they came, they shall take nothing for their toil, which they may carry away with their hands." The advice is clear. Do not be overawed or jealous when a man grows rich. A proper perspective is necessary for the spiritual discernment of life. What is that proper perspective? The destiny of the righteous is far better than the fleeting glory of the wicked. It won't be easy because the world tells us that greed is good. You will have to fight every day to defeat greed. But if the Apostle Paul could fight and endure the race, so can you. Paul tells us in 2 Timothy, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." Now here's the treasure that Paul says awaits him in heaven. For now on there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Let me see if I can summarize these passages with a story. There was a man who had everything he needed. He was blessed with land, health, family, home, and friends. But he wanted more. He wanted more land. To him, land represented wealth. His friend, the king, told him that he had been a very good loyal subject and said he could have as much land as he walked on as long as he returned to the spot he started from by sunset. As the man began to walk, he passed by those who were the hungry, the sick, the victims of brutality, all asking this man for help. But out of greed, he did not stop to help any of those in need. In fact, the man began to run in order to acquire more and more land. Finally, realizing that he must return to his starting point by sunset in order to take possession of all the land he had covered, he began to run faster and faster back to his starting point. Totally exhausted, the man could see from afar his starting point, and he pushed himself to run even faster. Just making it back in time before sunset, the man collapses and dies of exhaustion. Not only did the man lose his life to greed, but he lost his true treasure, his family and friends, and in the end, didn't even have a plot of land to be buried on. This man had an opportunity to help others, but instead, he helped himself. Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 26, verse 11, "The poor will always be with us." This is one of the misunderstood passages in the Bible. Was Jesus telling us that the problem of the poor could not be resolved here on earth? No. Instead, what Jesus was pointing to was the solution to having no poor among us lies with you and me, but because of greed, it persists. I think the theologian Thomas Aquinas said it better. When talking about greed, Thomas Aquinas said this: "It is a sin," speaking of greed, "directly against one's neighbor, since one man cannot overabound in eternal riches without another man lacking them. It is a sin against God, just as all mortals sin, inasmuch as man regard with contempt things eternal for the sake of temporal things. God created enough for all mankind to flourish, but due to greed, there's an imbalance in the distribution of resources, and thus we have the poor." In summary, this lesson tells us the following: do not let that which rusts and decay become your God. Focus on the many blessings that God has given you and not on coveting what others have. Remember to put God at the center of whatever He has given you. There's nothing wrong with achieving things in this life, but we must credit God for what we have achieved. In that way, we're saying, "Lord, you are my master, from which all good things flow." Remember, you are created for a purpose: to serve the Lord and the Lord only. Therefore, do not become a servant of greed. And if greed comes your way, fight it off with the full armor of God, especially with the shield of faith. Finally, your service to God means service to others as well. And therefore, do not let greed take you away from serving others. I pray that you were blessed by this lesson today, and that you will return next week as we continue to focus on greed. We invite you to join our Salem Church Growth Group by going to salembiblechurch.org and clicking on the loose banner. Thank you for joining us today. Be blessed and shalom.
I am loose from infirmities and disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing